Anchorage, the beating heart of Alaska, is a city that stands at the crossroads of natural splendor and human struggle. Tourists come to witness glaciers and the northern lights, yet only a few blocks away, men and women huddle in tents, battling the same biting cold that attracts visitors. The wilderness has long tested resilience, but now it unveils the fragility of life when shelter is absent.
It sucks being homeless, and I don't want to ever see none of my little girl homeless. She's 1 year old, my first baby.
This is not just Anchorage's battle, it's a stark reflection of America's harsh reality exposed in the frozen landscape. 1. The rising wave of homelessness in Anchorage. As of the latest count from the Anchorage Continuum of Care, 2,696 people are experiencing homelessness in the city today, with nearly 600 living completely unsheltered. This means that hundreds of men and women are forced to sleep in tents, old cars, or makeshift shelters, trying to survive in a place where winter's deadly cold can easily take a life. This is no longer a hidden issue. It is out in the open, on sidewalks, in public parks, and along busy roads, staring the community in the face. The rise in homelessness didn't happen overnight. Like many cities across America, Anchorage has been grappling with poverty, rising rents, and a broken mental health system for years. Then came the pandemic, which hit hardest for those already living paycheck to paycheck. Jobs disappeared, savings were drained, and housing costs climbed even higher. By 2023, shelters were overflowing and affordable housing units vanished the moment they became available. The outcome was tragically predictable. More people were pushed outside, with no roof, no heat, and little hope of climbing back up. If you walk through neighborhoods like Northwood or down Strawberry Road, you'll find clusters of tents patched with tarps and plywood. Inside are not just strangers, but people who once had steady lives, construction workers, waitresses, veterans, and even families who once owned home. The question that resounds throughout Anchorage is a simple one. How can a city with so much land and resources allow its residents to live this way? And beyond that, what does this say about the state of homelessness in America as a whole? Anchorage's struggle mirrors what is unfolding in cities like Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. More people on the streets, shelters overwhelmed, and local leaders scrambling for answers. But Anchorage carries an added burden. In this city, winter temperatures often drop far below zero. Here, homelessness isn't just a challenge. It can be a death sentence. When we talk about homelessness, many often picture a solitary man on the roadside, struggling with addiction. However, in Anchorage, the reality is far more complex. The city's homeless population spans every age, gender, and background, and their stories challenge the stereotypes that often shape public opinion. Alaska Natives are the most disproportionately affected group. Despite making up only about 15% of Anchorage's population, they account for nearly half of the homeless. Generations of displacement, systemic racism, and limited access to opportunity have left deep scars. Many who move from rural villages to the city in search of work or healthcare find themselves overwhelmed by high living costs and little support. They are often the first to fall through the cracks. Women and children fleeing domestic violence face a devastating reality of their own. Shelters like Awake are almost always full, forcing many into impossible choices. Maria, a young mother of 2, fled an abusive partner and ended up living in her car through a bitter winter. "I told my kids it was camping," she said, "but I cried every night." Stories like hers reveal a silent tragedy rarely seen in the headlines. Older adults and people with disabilities are also particularly vulnerable. Many seniors, after decades of hard work, now find their retirement income unable to keep up with rising rents. For them, homelessness is not just about losing shelter, but about exposure to illness, hunger, and the painful erosion of dignity in old age. Young people are increasingly visible on the streets as well. Teenagers and young adults, some LGBTQ+, and rejected by family, are turning to the streets, often falling into cycles of exploitation or addiction. One 19-year-old describes survival as choosing between warmth, safety, and a place to sleep. Finally, the largest group remains single men, many battling untreated mental illness or substance abuse. While they face the most stigma, their struggles are a direct reflection of systemic failures, a lack of accessible mental health care, limited treatment programs, and jobs that no longer pay enough to live on. Anchorage's homeless population demonstrates that vulnerability cuts across nearly every demographic: Alaska Natives, women and children, seniors, the disabled, and youth. Homelessness here isn't about a few unfortunate lives. It is about structural inequities colliding with personal hardship. If this is happening in Anchorage, what does it reveal about the broader crisis of homelessness in America? When people in Anchorage lose their homes, the support systems designed to catch them are fragile at best. Shelters, food banks, and outreach programs exist, and many nonprofit workers and volunteers devote themselves tirelessly to the cause. Yet, the scale of the crisis overwhelms everything in place. What was originally designed to handle short-term emergencies is now straining under the weight of a long-term disaster. The Anchorage Continuum of Care, COSI, has been the backbone of local coordination, successfully moving more than 6,800 people into housing since 2017. Over 3/4 of them managed to remain stably housed for at least 2 years, providing clear proof that intervention works. However, the waiting list tells a much harder truth. More than 3,000 people are still stuck in tents, cars, or overcrowded shelters, waiting for housing options that may never come. Affordable units are scarce, and the list barely moves. Emergency shelters provide temporary relief, but their capacity is consistently stretched. When a large shelter on East 56th Avenue closed in April 2025, hundreds were forced back into the cold. Winter in Anchorage turns these closures into life-threatening events. In the absence of these shelters, hospitals, police stations, and even libraries often become makeshift shelters, stretching institutions never intended for such a role. Food programs, mostly run by churches and nonprofits, keep thousands from going hungry every week, but they rely on donations and short-term grants that can dry up unexpectedly. The same instability haunts mental health and addiction services. Anchorage faces a severe shortage of psychiatrists, treatment beds, and recovery programs. As a result, many people cycle endlessly between the street, the ER, and jail, never receiving the consistent care they need to rebuild their lives. Camp abatements add yet another layer of instability. City crews clear out encampments citing health and safety concerns, but the impact is devastating. Tents, medications, personal IDs, all are lost in the process. For someone already hanging by a thread, losing these essentials can reset their progress back to zero. It forces the question, are these sweeps solving homelessness or merely scattering it across new neighborhoods? To make matters worse, federal budget cuts of nearly $10 billion have drained housing and homelessness programs nationwide. For Anchorage, that means fewer grants, fewer construction projects, and fewer long-term solutions. Local churches and community groups have tried to fill the gap. Initiatives like In Our Backyard have built tiny home villages offering safety and dignity for older residents. These projects are small, but they show that hope can survive even when systems falter. Still, the larger picture is sobering. Anchorage's safety net was never built for a crisis of this magnitude. It was meant to address short-term disruptions, not years of rising rents, untreated addiction, and growing desperation. So, the question remains, if the safety net cannot hold the weight of today's reality, what future lies ahead, not just for Anchorage, but for the broader crisis of homelessness in America? Homelessness in Anchorage is not a random occurrence. It is the result of powerful forces that have been building for years. While numerous issues contribute to the crisis, three stand out as the most critical: the severe shortage of affordable housing, the high cost of living coupled with economic instability, and the devastating impact of addiction and untreated mental illness. Together, these forces create a cycle that traps thousands of residents, making recovery extraordinarily difficult. At the heart of the problem lies the housing shortage. Over the past decade, the construction of affordable housing units has failed to keep up with demand. Middle-income families often find themselves competing for the same apartments as low-income residents, and landlords naturally prioritize tenants with stable jobs and strong credit history. For those living paycheck to paycheck, even a modest rent increase of a few $100s can result in eviction. Once displaced, their options are painfully limited. Shelters are already at capacity, or they face a life on the streets. While housing first models in other cities have shown that stability begins with a roof, in Anchorage, that roof remains out of reach for too many. The cost of living in Anchorage only exacerbates the housing crisis. Alaska's geographic isolation drives up the price of nearly everything, from groceries and heating fuel to medical supplies and transportation. A gallon of milk or a tank of gas can cost far more than in the lower 48. Meanwhile, many jobs here are tied to seasonal industries such as fishing, tourism, and construction. These positions may pay well in the short term, but offer no stability once the season ends. For families already on the edge, a car repair, a health emergency, or reduction in work hours can push them over the line into homelessness. The margin between survival and crisis is razor thin. Finally, addiction and mental health issues weigh heavily on Anchorage's streets. The spread of fentanyl and methamphetamine has left devastation in its wake, pulling people into dependency with little chance of recovery. But the drugs themselves are only part of the story. Anchorage suffers from a chronic shortage of treatment beds, psychiatrists, and long-term recovery programs. Too often, people battling depression, PTSD or schizophrenia end up cycling between emergency rooms, jails, and encampments. These are stopgaps, not solutions, and they do nothing to address the deeper needs of individuals trying to reclaim their lives. Without comprehensive mental health and addiction services, any effort to end homelessness will fall short. Together, these three forces, housing scarcity, the crushing cost of daily life, and untreated addiction and mental illness, form the core of Anchorage's homelessness crisis. Addressing only one of these factors will not suffice. Real progress depends on confronting all three, with strategies that provide stability, dignity, and a genuine path forward. Anchorage has attempted to respond to its homelessness crisis, but the measures taken often reveal more about the limits of the system than its strengths. In recent years, the city has experimented with both compassionate interventions and stricter enforcement, creating a patchwork of policies that sometimes offer relief, but at other times exacerbate the problem. On the supportive side, local leaders and nonprofits have implemented programs aimed at permanent housing solutions. The Anchorage Continuum of Care has successfully placed thousands of individuals into stable homes, and initiatives such as rapid rehousing and rent assistance vouchers have shown measurable success. Community-driven efforts, like the development of tiny home villages and church-sponsored transitional housing projects, also highlight the innovation that emerges when traditional approaches fall short. These programs demonstrate that with the right tools and resources, people can be lifted out of homelessness for good. However, at the same time, the city has leaned heavily on enforcement strategies. In July 2025, the Anchorage Assembly passed a controversial ordinance imposing fines and possible jail time on individuals camping near schools, playgrounds, and residential zones. Officials defended this measure as a way to keep neighborhoods safe, but critics argue that it criminalizes poverty. By pushing people into the legal system, the policy makes it even harder for them to secure employment and housing in the future. Rather than solving the issue, it merely shifts the problem into courtrooms and jails, perpetuating the cycle of homelessness. The fragility of Anchorage's shelter system adds yet another barrier. In early 2025, several large shelters were forced to close due to staffing shortages and funding gaps, displacing hundreds of people overnight. Temporary warming centers were set up, but they lacked coordination with longer-term housing programs, leaving many residents trapped in a cycle of short stays and constant uncertainty. Perhaps the greatest obstacle is the ongoing funding shortfalls. Nationwide cuts of nearly $10 billion to housing and homelessness services have stripped cities of crucial federal support. For Anchorage, this means fewer affordable housing developments, reduced access to supportive services, and a heavy reliance on underfunded nonprofits. Without consistent investment, even the most promising local initiatives struggle to expand. Access rules also pose challenges. Some shelters maintain sobriety requirements, which effectively exclude those most in need of stable environments. Others prioritize families, leaving single adults, who make up the majority of the homeless population, with fewer options. While these restrictions are often well-intended, they frequently undermine the core purpose of a safety net. Anchorage now faces a critical policy decision: continue managing homelessness through regulations and enforcement, or prioritize long-term solutions such as housing first, expanded behavioral health services, and affordable housing construction. The path chosen will determine whether the crisis is reduced or merely relocated out of public view. To address homelessness, Anchorage must move from short-term fixes to lasting solutions. The most effective model is Housing First, which has worked in cities like Houston and Salt Lake City. This approach provides permanent housing without preconditions, recognizing that stability is the foundation for recovery, employment, and health. Research shows that once housed, people are more likely to seek treatment, find work, and reintegrate into their communities. Expanding affordable housing is central to Anchorage's strategy. This includes building new units, protecting existing low-cost housing, and offering rent support to prevent displacement. Collaboration between the government, developers, and nonprofits will be key to achieving these goals. Mental health and addiction services must also grow. Anchorage needs more treatment beds, long-term recovery programs, and stronger connections between housing and healthcare. Without these, the cycle of relapse and homelessness will continue. Prevention is equally important. People leaving prisons, hospitals, or foster care should not fall into homelessness. Survivors of domestic violence need secure housing options to rebuild safely. Community-driven projects, such as tiny home villages, have shown promise and should be scaled. Anchorage must view homelessness as a humanitarian crisis requiring compassion and resolve. With the right policies, Anchorage can follow the example of other cities, showing that progress is possible when housing is treated as a human right. Reflecting on Anchorage's crisis, it becomes clear that homelessness is not simply about lacking shelter, it's about dignity, equity, and the moral fabric of our society. When I see images of elderly men huddled in tents during an Alaskan winter or young children lining up for meals in a church basement, I am reminded that this crisis is not distant, it is here in our own communities. There is a tendency, especially in political debates, to reduce homelessness to statistics or policy jargon. But behind every number is a person with a story, a veteran who once served their country, a woman who fled abuse, a teenager cast aside by their family. These are not strangers. They are neighbors, fellow citizens, and part of our shared humanity. Anchorage is just one city, but its struggles reflect the broader reality of homelessness in America. The cold, unforgiving climate of Alaska magnifies the dangers, but the underlying forces, housing costs, addiction, mental health gaps, and systemic inequities are shared nationwide. What happens in Anchorage is not an isolated tragedy. It is a mirror held up to the entire country. And so, the question we must ask ourselves is not just how Anchorage can solve its homelessness crisis, but how America as a whole will respond to the growing number of people living without shelter. Will we continue to rely on punitive measures that criminalize poverty, or will we embrace bold, compassionate solutions that restore dignity and hope? Conclusion: Anchorage stands at a crossroads. The homelessness crisis exposes deep inequities, fragile safety nets, and the failure of short-term fixes. Yet it also reveals what works: housing first programs, community-driven efforts, and the relentless resilience of those who continue to fight. Moving forward demands bold leadership, sustained funding, and a conviction that housing is a right, not a privilege. This is not just Anchorage's challenge. It is America's story. The question is clear: will we turn away, or will we embrace compassion and real solutions?